Good morning.
Good morning, Tony.
Good morning. I have enabled the waiting room.
Okay. Have the hosts and co-hosts been assigned?
Yes. Pauline is now the host.
Okay.
Now admitting Stella.
Good morning, everyone. Just requesting to have Leslie as co-host also, part of our AM team.
Yes.
Thank you.
And so,
And maybe you could start with the language interpretation so we could also test. I could see we already have Linda.
Okay.
Would Pauline do that? Or we also have our IT support, Justin, but yeah.
Pauline.
I'll go over the Chinese channel to check with Linda.
Okay.
Good morning, Linda. Yeah, this is Zoe. Good morning. All good? Okay, just noting also that all good with the Chinese channel. Thank you. Okay. So Tony, we have I'm assuming we have Chinese attendees joining.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So if they have some questions, they would just also type in the chat box, and our interpreter would also interpret if there are Chinese languages in the chat box.
I believe so, yes. They
Okay.
will stay all throughout the event.
Okay, I'll do that. Hi, Linda and Annie. Good morning. Yes, so I've just mentioned earlier that if we have some Chinese questions in the chat box, you'd also interpret and send in the English interpretation there. Audio background to go with that, that would be good. And just let us know if we'll open the waiting room for the participants. So it's 5 minutes before the start time.
I think we should open it.
Okay, but right now we only have 2 people, but we could open it now.
Sure.
Okay. So we have the photo take and we have the holding slide up. So we'll open the waiting room now. So I'll be on mute now. Thank you, everyone.
It is 9 o'clock. Let's start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar on the fascinating topic of the role of local governments in promoting high quality growth. My name is Yolanda Fernandez Lomen, and I am ADB's Country Director in the People's Republic of China. I'm delighted to be here today participating in this important event. Before we start, let me remind participants about the house rules. Very quickly, please keep your mics on mute for the duration of the session. Select the simultaneous translation channel as needed. We have Chinese and English channels. Post your questions in the chat box and note that the materials will be shared after the session. With no further ado, let me invite Ms. Teresa Ko, ADB's Director General of the East Asia Department, to launch the webinar by delivering the opening remarks. DG Ko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yolanda, and welcome to everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We will focus on the role of local governments in achieving a high-quality growth agenda in the People's Republic of China. I'm Teresa Ko, and I'm the Director General for the East Asia Department. Today's webinar is a first in a series of 5 webinars that will be organized around the general themes of fiscal management, local governance, and economic growth in the post-COVID-19 world, all of which will be jointly hosted by the Public Management, Financial Sector, and Regional Cooperation and Integration Division of the East Asia Department, and the SDCC's governance thematic group, and particularly by the Secretariat. The presentation that will be delivered today to start the event is based on a working paper that was published last year and which was co-authored by Professor Etisham Ahmad and Hans van Rijn. The original version of the working paper, which was prepared in 2019, was delivered as part of an engagement between the National Development and Reform Commission and ADB, and served as an input to the formulation and preparation of the 14th five-year plan. For the past 40 years, PRC has seen remarkable growth. As you know, it has lifted millions out of poverty, but this focus on growth has come at a cost, particularly on environmental degradation, on socioeconomic and regional inequalities, and on building up of debt at the local government level. Under the high-quality growth agenda, the People's Republic of China seeks to rebalance the economy by addressing those negative side effects, and local governments will have a key role to play in the implementation of that agenda. In the PRC, around 85% of public services are delivered at the subnational level, which makes the role of local governments quite critical in ensuring that these services are provided in a responsive manner. And at the same time, as we will see in the presentation, the regulatory, policy, and fiscal environment in which local governments operate in the PRC poses several challenges to the efficient and equitable delivery of high-quality public services. And as such, the role of local governments in driving the high-quality growth agenda is also constrained. I think it is important to note that the working paper was prepared before the COVID-19 pandemic came upon us. In their presentation, the co-authors have tried to assess the consequence of the pandemic and the current recovery process for the paper's main findings and recommendations. As such, the presentation provides an update of the original working paper. At the last part of today's events, we will be inviting participants for comments on today's presentation and the key messages that were communicated. Let me conclude by handing it back to the chair of today's event, Ms. Yolanda Fernandez Loman, Country Director of ADB's Resident Mission in the PRC. I'm really happy that she has agreed to guide today's proceedings. Thank you, and over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you very much, DG Ko, for your insightful remarks. Moving on to the presentation, I am delighted to invite my colleague, Hans van Rijn, Principal Public Management Specialist in ADB's East Asia Department, and extend the warm welcome to Professor Etisham Ahmad from the London School of Economics. They will present the main findings of the work on the role of local governments in promoting high quality growth. The presentation will be followed by the views of 3 discussants, which I will introduce later. Please kindly note that the allocated time for the presentation is 40 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. I'm asking Etisham to load the presentation at this stage. Before I will hand it over to my co-presenter, Professor Ahmad. I just want to provide a little bit of background on the whereabouts of this working paper and the origins of this presentation. Next slide, Etisham, please. As Teresa already mentioned in her opening remarks, neither the working paper nor this presentation came out of the thin air. It was actually part of a wider engagement between ADB and the NDRC that started in 2018, and which was focused on the review of the 13th five-year plan, and which also attempted to provide analytical inputs into the preparations of the 14th five-year plan. One of the areas where ADB and the NDRC engaged was on financing options for high quality growth. And that topic translated into the working paper that was published last year, which was entitled The Role of Local Governments in Driving the High Quality Growth Agenda. I'm happy to say that quite a few of the proposals were actually included in the 14th five-year plan and the perspective plan, including some of the proposals that were made in the local government working paper. So in this presentation, what we will do is we will ask to what extent are the original recommendations and the original analysis still relevant in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for China to build back better and to recover from the pandemic. In doing so, we've taken an analytical approach to building back better in China, which will be explained by Professor Ahmad in the succeeding slides. And we will, in doing so, we will build on lessons learned from the 2008 and 2010 crisis, and of course also on lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. And we will end with some recommendations towards an action plan for further cooperation also between ADB and the NDRC and the Ministry of Finance. With that, let me hand it over to Etisham to take the presentation further.
Thank you very much, Director General. Thank you very much, Yolanda and Hans. It was indeed a great pleasure and an honor to be asked to participate in this really very important work that the ADB provided for the PRC. It actually built on an ongoing research program that we have at the LSE on sustainable growth in emerging market countries, in particular China and Mexico. And in the Chinese case, it was a basis of collaborating with a network of Chinese colleagues from CAS, from the Central University of Economics and Business, Fudan, Zhejiang, and Sun Yat-sen, and also with colleagues at the World Bank. So there's a fair amount of detailed work which went behind the recommendations, which you haven't seen. But I think the answer to the question that Hans posed is, are the recommendations still relevant? And I'd say yes. Just that some of the sequencing may be more important than we had originally envisaged. And from what I hear from colleagues in the Ministry of Finance is that work is underway. And the key issues that I would point to, I mean, you've seen the outlines of the 14th five-year plan. Let me highlight a few of them. Together with the work we're doing in other countries and also for the G7, the key issue in building back better is sustainable employment. And of course, meeting the goals of the recirculation in the dual circulation and rebalancing, which are very important in the plan, implying that one is shifting from exports to domestic consumption and from investment to consumption, implying also that the generation of internal interior hubs for sustainable development is increasingly important. But it also means the transformation of major metropolitan areas together with the, almost unique creation of the high-tech zones in the south, which is the Greater Bay Area. Yangtze River Delta is another one. And there's nothing like this anywhere else, or it could become a model for countries in South Asia or in Latin America. The key issue really from our perspective is that for the first time, it envisages and acknowledges that there is a need for local own source revenues. So that's article number 22 in the fifth plenum document. It focuses on inequalities, and therefore the rebalancing is again critical. And a key issue, of course, also is peaking net emissions by 2030. This has major implications in the structure of investment and production and the way the cities are organized, and the transition costs have to be kept in mind. So really, the 14th five-year plan is actually very sensible, and I shall proceed with looking at some of the key issues that take on greater importance. The key issue, of course, in our view is that one has to be clearer about which level of government carries out what activities, how this is coordinated and financed. And this is a critical finding from the pandemic, not just in China, but even in countries like the United States, where national coordination and financing has become critical together with the local provision of vaccination, tracking and tracing. So this then builds on the Chinese governance model, which is the Qiao, which is the vertical, and Kuai, which is the horizontal flows of information and linkages. And I'll come back to this issue because it affects really what one thinks about when one considers the decentralization agenda. But the key issue, of course, has been for some time, and increasingly so, is reducing vulnerabilities, both financial, distributional, and environmental risks. This was a key element in the medium-term budget in 2018, and it's really a function of the huge buildup of liabilities without local own source revenues. And this is a point I shall keep coming back to again and again. It comes back also to looking at the appropriate level of assignments, looking at the buildup of liability, and avoiding excessive post-COVID leverage. And that is something that the Chinese government has been very careful about. And the stimulus that has been provided since the COVID of around 4.5% of GDP is considerably less than the 11% or so, which was injected after the 2008-10 financial crisis. So really, they're very cognizant of the increased leverage in China and the liabilities and the dangers for macro stability. So let's just look at some of the reasoning behind our recommendations and linking international experience to the Chinese governance model. It is very important to keep in mind that China is not a country where yardstick competition, so as defined, works, which is the basis for decentralized governance in the European or the United States models. In any recovery from the pandemic, and this is global, a key issue is that the public investment and tax decisions must be coordinated. It's not just for coordinating revenues and expenditures, but also to generate the appropriate incentives for firms, workers, and local governments. And one has to put appropriate weights on human, social, and natural capital in addition to financial returns. This is something that my colleague Nick Stern wrote about in his paper on growth, again, for the ADB and input into the 14th five-year plan. And this is, again, really a key element in the work that we are doing together for the G20 and then also for COP26. The importance of coordinating public investment tax decision at different levels of government. So really, it comes down to addressing the incentive structures for local governments. At the moment, every incentive for local government is to hide liabilities in the face of budgetary pressures. The problem has been that without own source revenues and following the 2015 tax reform, when the business tax was incorporated into value added tax, there are no tax handles left at the local levels. They do get shared revenues, but the shared revenues fluctuate as the central government cuts taxes for counter-cyclical fiscal policy. There are assured transfers, but because these are transfers, they cannot be adjusted in order to meet the additional spending that's necessary to meet liabilities. So really, neither shared revenues nor assured transfers are adequate to underpin a debt program. And this is, again, quite standard, and I'll come back to this again. This is the typical Simonson model of debt sustainability. The other problem is that although the Chinese government has adopted the IMF's GFSM standards at the national level, and I was involved, I was at the IMF when we worked with the Ministry of Finance to do this in early 2001 and 2. It's not been rolled down to local governments. And some of the work I've been doing with a colleague, Professor Zhang Xiaorong from Fudan, looking at local government balance sheets in a number of smaller cities, so it proves very difficult to actually get to a true figure of the true level of the liabilities. And my colleague, Yang Quan-she of the Central University of Economics, argues that because there is incomplete information, a lot of pressures on local governments, the incentives are to keep financing by liabilities, and that generates a local debt spiral. Let me see if I can, yeah. So in China, the coordination between the vertical and the horizontal was important in the COVID response. The lack of full information at the city level in Wuhan led to some of the delays that we know about in actually transmitting information up to the central government. But once the central government realized what was going on, it was able to act very quickly with the Chao linkages, both in terms of finance and coordination. So really what is critical in China, in the United States, in Germany, is the ability of the central government to finance the additional spending when there is a major catastrophe or a pandemic. So the issue really is, what are the information flows going up, and how is the coordination at the local level managed? So the problem has been that the institutions that exist at the moment require further work, and the assignments for local governments are way beyond what they can finance. So really, clearly, just for the preventive healthcare, looking at, and also basic education, tracking and tracing, and commitments to peak emissions by 2030 require actions at the local level. But it involves coordination from the center and also some financing. So earmark transfers have to be monitored. So that's where the performance indicators come in. I'll come to the limitations of performance budgeting in a situation where the assignments are not well determined, which is the case now in China. So this is a model of the Chao Kuai information flows. The lighter arrows are instructions and finance. The darker arrows are the flows of information. So really, the flows to the mayor are deficient. And they're quite happy with that, because really it enables them to push inconvenient responsibilities off budget. That's the way they, also can, it leads to rent-seeking behavior. So really, this is a problem. And it's something that I think the Chinese government is aware of. A lot of the off-budget activities have been linked to land sales, which have led to increasing urban sprawl. This is part of land value capture. It's very problematic in China. It's problematic in Mexico. It's problematic in India. So really in a whole range of countries, the model of land sales or land value capture going into off-budget accounts is problematic. So really, many of the recommendations that we're thinking about are alternatives to what has become or had been recommended by a number of our colleagues in the IFIs to as the financing instrument for local governments, except that it doesn't work if the environment is also one of the considerations, or stopping corruption and leakages. So really there are increasing budgetary pressures at the local level, and we saw that happening in 2018 with the trade disruptions. The local governments were told to make sure that people are not laid off. And there was less attention to basic preventive healthcare than might have been the case. Now, Wuhan is a city which has had a lot of connectivity, infrastructure, center of high-speed trains. It's got a sponge city, which has been very well thought of. It's got clean buildings. It's got 9 metro lines and others on the way. So really, it's a city which is modern, and it is really what one would normally recommend for a clean metropolitan area. The problem has been that you have no idea about how these investments are going to be financed. And we found difficulty in putting together a balance sheet for 2 small cities. Putting together a balance sheet for Wuhan would be quite an undertaking, which at least we did not have the resources to even begin to consider. So the problem was that it was not on the radar of the mayor of Wuhan to be bothered with some doctor in a hospital who said there's a virus floating around. So that's the issue, that key responsibilities get pushed away by high-sounding investments. So it's important to sequence and align responsibility for policy, finance, and administration, for example, for preventive healthcare. And then if you are also providing transfers from the central government, they have to be in the chart of accounts. So just to summarize, the coordinated investment, tax, and sustainable development strategy, you put specific weights on capital of different sorts and labor. So you can then look at income distribution and employment, environment and pollution, and with the appropriate cost to public funds, you get a choice of investments. And the same criteria are used for tax reforms and the prioritization of national taxes and then local taxes. So together with governance and transfers, you get fiscal sustainability, the national level, and also at the subnational level. Now, I would point out that in a situation where you're not quite sure about spending responsibilities, own source revenues, it's dangerous to build medium-term fiscal strategies or fiscal rules, because it's a moving target. Now, what you really need is a sustainable employment hubs. National infrastructure connectivity is not sufficient. We have seen that in the 2000 Western Development Program, and a lot of the inequality, even in the richer provinces like Guangdong, Zhejiang. So really looking at urban design, you're looking at local infrastructure, local public services in smaller cities and county level districts in the interior, including in the richer provinces like Zhejiang and Guangdong, which we have looked at quite closely. So local public service delivery requires own source revenues, without which you cannot issue bonds or access public-private partnership, because it requires that the buildup of liabilities for sustainability must be met by the ability of the jurisdiction to raise own source revenues. And as we know, with transfers and shared revenues, own source revenues is zero. And if you take this, apply the Siemens condition, you want to link the additional debt to the additional ability to raise revenues. So the delta R is actually 0 in China. So it's very dangerous to go down this route. And whilst bond systems and PPPs are clearly necessary and important, the sequencing has perhaps been not the best that one would have recommended. So lessons from the post 2008-10 global crisis, there was quite a lot of emphasis on countercyclical investments, but they largely recreated the existing structure of activities and production. And you had the Western development strategy, and then in 2010 you had the rebalancing attempt, and they didn't quite work. Now you have the Go West and dual circulation. It's important to learn from what went wrong in the 2000s. Really looking at just rebalancing to clear interior employment hubs is appropriate, but it's constrained by the hidden debt and unclear responsibilities without own source revenue. So it's three things: hidden debt, unclear responsibilities, inadequate or absent own source revenues are a huge constraint in this strategy. This is an example from one of the county level cities that we looked at. It had good connectivity, should have been an ideal clean, compact city as an employment hub, but it continues to lose population. Spending assignments are onerous. Their debt is equal, the official debt is equivalent to 1,000% of GDP of revenues. The actual debt is 4 times higher than the official debt. And there are incentives for land sales and continued off-budget operations of the local government financing vehicles, and huge buildup of liabilities and incentives to pass them up to the province and to the central government. So this is the debt spiral that Yang Quan-she referred to. We see this in the city. So huge connectivity infrastructure in China, but it has not stopped flow of workers to the very large metropolitan area, Shanghai and Shenzhen. Colleague from the World Bank, Xubei Luo, did some work on the movement of labor over time, over 2 periods, and we see this pattern being continued in spite of the investment. And the issue of inequality within the provinces, even in the rich provinces, and management of risks. So these constrain the development of sustainable hubs. So the GFSM standards, as I said, are formally accepted by the central government, but not implemented yet at subnational levels. So the local incentive structures are not adequately defined. So this is a representation of interior hubs and rebalancing. So A in the middle is the existing coastal hub. Think of it as Shanghai or Guangzhou, and maybe around it you have the big innovation zones. The question is how to move production from Guangzhou to the interior of Guangdong or in the interior of China. And the ends are the new hubs. Of course, with Belt and Road, you see that there are changing value chains and the cost functions are changing. So one of the most interesting examples is the development of Khorgos on the Kazakh border, which has been actually built up by Jiangsu private enterprises, because it now pays them to have a hub on the border with Kazakhstan. But the issue really is that you're looking at the provision of public services and local infrastructure. And without that, this rebalancing, dual circulation is really not going to take off. So as I said, there are 4 different types of urban-rural structures: large metropolitan areas, shift to services, high-tech, clean buildings, electric vehicles. And then you've got the high-tech zones, the Greater Bay Area. There's a lot of work on this, and there may be need for new administrative and financing arrangements. This is work in progress. It's part of the work plan under the 14th Five-Year Plan in medium term. It's underway. It may require new administrative arrangements as well as financing. And then, of course, you've got the 13th five-year plan focus on the capital city clusters, which I think perhaps went too far, because you need not just the capital city, but you want smaller hubs inside the provinces, which are the tier 2 and 3 cities, which are the heart of connected, compact, clean urban design, especially in the interior and the West. Then, of course, you've got the rural revitalization agenda as well. So really, what we want is a rationalization of spending assignments. Now, it's been clear that the social security, given aging of the population, cannot be handled at the local level. But, you know, I was in a mission to China with the World Bank in 1989 on social security reform. And many of the things they're beginning to do now were recommended. It was with Tony Atkinson and myself and another colleague. And we had recommended many of the things they're thinking now, but haven't been able to do for political economy reasons. Similarly, a reassessment of subnational assignments and institutional arrangements were envisaged by State Council Directive 8 of 2018, but this takes time. These are very difficult things to unwind. And the example of the COVID and primary healthcare shows that it's not clear cut. You don't want to be pushing the entire responsibility for preventive healthcare on the shoulders of local governments, which is what the Trump administration tried to do. It requires coordination between different levels of government. Similarly, connectivity requires coordination between national and local. Local services for private investments. I spoke about Jorgos, changing relative cost structures. So really, the key lesson is that there is a need to coordinate the financing and local implementation, for example, for preventive healthcare. So this is an example of a set of functional responsibilities. And if you look at the tertiary or the basic preventive healthcare, which is middle of the first column, the compensation may be at the municipal level. The hiring may be at the municipal level, but they may not be able to pay for the teachers. Use of goods and services may be a central assignment, which is these are the vaccines. It's clear that it couldn't have been managed at the municipal level. Then there's a fixed capital costs, again, either provinces or the central government. Then you've got non-financial assets, administration and programs, sub-programs, outputs and outcomes. And if you put the matrix together, you have essentially a set of assignments that have to be worked out. You're not just pushing primary healthcare to the local level, you're pushing part of primary healthcare. So the financing coordination elements are likely to remain overlapping, as is the case in Germany, with multiple overlapping responsibilities, as opposed to the US model, which is complete autonomy for all the functions. But in order to have complete autonomy, you need your own source of revenues. Even for partial autonomy, you need own source revenues. So the problem here is that any decentralization without addressing the assignment of revenues is meaningless. You end up with unfunded mandates. There are many cases in Asia I can talk about where they have tried to decentralize and all they've done is shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. So now in terms of the tax assignments, the problem with the sharing of the income tax is that when the central government cuts income tax rates for counter-cyclical fiscal policy, it squeezes local government finances. If there were a piggyback, certain percentage points on the central tax base, it means that A, it's stable, and B, it can be used to anchor access to credit. So your bond system requires something like a piggyback on the income tax. Another issue is a national carbon tax with a local piggyback, which would allow cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou to impose higher rates consistent with congestion and pollution. And the final recommendation is something that we're working on as an alternative to land value capture and land sales, is a beneficial property tax. Because again, the US type property tax was, as you know, tried in Shanghai and Chongqing. It did not work. It doesn't work in Mexico, which has been running it for almost 100 years. It doesn't work in India, where it's been running for 150 years. So really, in the sense, you have a tax which doesn't work for political economy reasons. And what we are suggesting is that the beneficial property tax, which is very simple to administer and linked to local public services, gets around the political economy problem. You don't need the cadastre, you don't need ownership titles, and it can be implemented very quickly. And this is critical for the establishment of employment hubs. What we did together with colleagues from CAS, and they kindly made available to us their survey of 6 major cities, and we simulated a 2% of GDP tax on properties in these cities. Of course, you can really what you need to do is to break it down within cities to smaller jurisdictions. This really extrapolates the model now that is functioning in the UK, which abandoned the US type property tax under Margaret Thatcher. So if you have a 2% property tax in these 6 cities, it ranges from 121 yuan per square meter in Guangzhou to 48 yuan per square meter in Xi'an. So already there are incentives for firms and workers to move from Guangzhou to Xi'an or to smaller cities in the provinces. And we show that for a number of these cities, just the tax alone improves the income distribution. And you look at the income distribution at different parts of the income distribution. If you have the Atkinson index, which with the weight on the lower end of the income scale, and the Gini coefficient, which really focuses on the middle, it shows you the differences with the tax alone or the tax with the benefits. And then we looked at Guangzhou, which spends around just over 2% on education. In different districts of Guangzhou, 2% would generate much more than the required 2% for education spending. So really what this shows is that even with a simple tax, which generates 2% of metropolitan income, you need an equalization framework to be able to provide similar levels of service at similar levels of tax effort. So this is the principle of equalization, which, by the way, is adopted or has been adopted in China since 1994. It was done by Chen Shixin, your vice president, who went to Australia for a year to learn the Australian model and came back with a much better model than the Australians have, which, by the way, the Australians copied in 2006. So really, the final part of the agenda is managing local risks. And you cannot manage local risks without a proper chart of accounts and balance sheet. And the international standard, which has been accepted by PRC, is the GFSM. That's the IMF, OECD, UN model. It's linked to the UN system of national accounts and the fiscal accounts of the IMF. So GFSM balance sheet provides information on the buildup of liabilities and net assets, all levels of government, essential to have that. If you want a proper operation of local government bond markets and PPPs, the IPSAS regulation says that if PPPs are for assets that revert to the state, they must be on the balance sheet. That's not the GFS, that's the IPSAS regulation. So really all these standards point to the need to recognize the buildup of liability, not constrain it to whether or not it is in the central government or the budgetary local government. And then, of course, for the effective operation of performance-based transfers, you need the informations. And here this is a typical chart of accounts, which looks at institutions, sources of funds, UN, OECD, functional classification. We just looked at it for education and health. Then you've got administrative classification, ministries, departments, down to local governments. Then you've got programs and sub-programs, projects, location, level of government, municipalities. And then the economic classification, which is the core of the revenue, expense, and asset and liabilities, then outputs and outcomes for performance evaluation purposes. So you need all of these together with own source revenues before you can move to performance budgeting. But you can make a start with central government transfers, even if the assignments have not yet been worked out. So that's really, in sum, very quickly, may have taken a little longer than I should have, the work program and the recommendations on the fiscal agenda going forward. As you can see, I believe the Ministry of Finance is working on a new property tax legislation. I hope that they will look at some of the suggestions we have, because the US type model was even abandoned in the United Kingdom. So you have to be careful with it. Didn't work in Shanghai, Chongqing. So really, that's what I'd say. And then let me pass this back to Hans to complete the presentation.
Thank you very much, Etison. I will try to bring the presentation home by quickly summarizing the main challenges and opportunities that we identified in this presentation. And then also I'll end with some possible areas of future engagement between the ADB and the Chinese government. So the main challenges that we identified were challenges related to the clarification or rationalization of spending assignments across the local government system, including, of course, importantly, the new urban structures that are developing. The State Council is working on that, but that's, of course, a huge and highly complicated task. Then the issue of the lack of substantial own source revenues that has been highlighted by Etisham a number of times. The incomplete equalization system, especially below the provincial level. The need to strengthen public financial management systems and practices, including the rollout of the Treasury single account. A foundation to do this, of course, is to improve the credibility of the balance sheets and to try and get all the contingent liabilities on those sheets. The further development of the special bond markets for local governments, including green bonds, and of course the strengthening of debt analytics and debt management. In terms of the opportunities, we see that the State Council has started to address the rationalization of spending assignments. There is a lot of thought about the adoption of national tax policies permitting piggybacks at the local government level, for example, on personal income tax and carbon tax, within the administrative purview of the State Tax Authority. Discussions are going on to introduce a local beneficial property tax. At the moment, of course, a lot of work is done to strengthen the preconditions for the responsible use of special bonds and PPPs. And then, of course, there's the flagship MOF initiative of rolling out the performance-based budgeting also to the local government level. And again, a precondition to do that, as emphasized a couple of times, is to strengthen the credibility of the balance sheets at the local government level. Finally, last slide. At the moment, the ADB is involved in some of the areas that we identified. We have an ongoing TA with the China Government Debt Center, which is part of the MOF's budget department. We are working, or we started work this year with the NDRC's Social Development and Systems Reform departments on strengthening the performance monitoring of service delivery at the local level and on finding ways to optimize the balance between private and non-private actors within economic sectors. We are at the moment preparing a TA with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences that looks at the fiscal sustainability challenge underpinning social security in China. We are working on several knowledge products. One is a comprehensive fiscal management assessment of the PRC. We're working on a guidance note on local government debt sustainability assessments, which can be used as part of the preparation of future projects. And we are working on a technical paper on green recovery. Now, as you can imagine, of course, most of these issues, especially those related to local government debt, are quite sensitive. So it's not easy to build rapport and to engage in those areas, but at least we've started. So I hope going forward that we can both broaden and strengthen this engagement. Thank you very much. With this, we come to the end of the presentation. I'll hand it back to Yolanda.
Thank you very much. So let me thank the speakers for the excellent presentation, which I am sure will elicit good and interesting comments from our distinguished discussants. So let me briefly introduce them. Jose Antonio Tan, Director of Public Management, Financial Sector and Regional Cooperation Division at ADB Southeast Asia Department, followed by Radhika Lal, Regional Advisor on SDG Financing at the UNDP's Hub for Asia and the Pacific, and my colleague Emma Fan, Director of Public Management, Financial Sector and Regional Cooperation in ADB's East Asia Department. May I invite Jose Antonio Tan to share his views? I understand he has another appointment at 10 o'clock, so please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Yolanda, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody in this call. First, I'd like to say that the presentation of SM Enhance are quite good and quite interesting, and a lot of insights. For my comments, what I plan to do is really to draw from the points raised in the presentation and draw some parallels in what we are doing in Southeast Asia, mainly Philippines and Indonesia, where we're doing a lot of work on local governance reform. So I'll make a few comments based on that one. What I could say first is that actually the challenges that was posted in presentation of spending assignments, own source revenues, equalization, debt is really a common strand across most local governments, even in our region, in Southeast Asia. And this is really common also in Philippines and in Indonesia. So I have a few points here. My first point is that I do agree with Hans and Etisham on the importance of the local governments in the COVID-19 response. We are seeing that in the Philippines and Indonesia. We're seeing that the local governments really are taking charge of contact tracing, to enforce the lockdowns, and to organize the vaccinations. They also play a key role in delivering the social assistance and cash handouts to most beneficiaries. So again, this is a point that the level of capacities of the local governments right now actually depended on what was done in the past in terms of the local government reforms done by countries. So again, we have mixed, we see mixed things here. We see that the richer local governments are able to deliver better, of course, and same time, the poorer ones lack the capacity, the infrastructure to deliver these services. So, and to move to my second point, one of the main problems, as what's pointed in the presentation, is that the importance of revenue and spending assignments to local governments. The Philippines had its reforms on decentralization way back in '91, and for Indonesia, as early in around the early 2000s, 2001 and 2004, if I recall correctly. But the issue of revenue and spending assignments continues to hound the decentralization process. Okay, there are issues on vertical imbalances. That's how spending functions are distributed across different levels, the different types of local governments, as compared to the revenue assignments or the fiscal transfers. For example, in Indonesia, the spending of districts is 32% of the general government spending, but their own source revenues, as pointed out as a key issue also could be in China, is only 5% of the total government revenues. So what we see is a dependence on transfers. In the Philippines, new development is broadening of the definition of national taxes that are to be shared with the local governments. This brings, I think this is adds around 220 billion pesos to the transfers to the local governments. However, there seems to be a possibility of a greater imbalance between expenditure assignments and revenue shares across different types of local governments. One study shows that under the new arrangement, it is possible that the province's share in revenues is at 23%, yet the expenditures that may be transferred to them is at around 38% of the increase in the fiscal transfers. In the same token, in the barangays, which are the smallest level of units of local units in the Philippines, their revenue share is at 20%, yet their spending share that assigned to them is only at around 4%. So we are seeing this imbalance happening in these countries. Then also you can also see the horizontal imbalances within each level of local government. So between cities and between governments, there too are some problems in terms of the balancing of the transfers and spending. Now, I think there's a lot to learn by Southeast Asia, Philippines, and Indonesia from the PRC in terms of equalization mechanisms. Although that I understand is also a concern in China. My third point is really on the high degree of dependence on fiscal transfers. Hence, it is always critical to have a good design of these fiscal transfers. Here we have two models in my region. In Indonesia, they have quite a complex system. They have five types of transfers. They have the DAU, which is a general allocation grant, which is based on the fiscal needs. Basically, it feeds mainly on the wage bill of the workers in local governments. You have the DBH, which is the revenue sharing grant based on the national taxes and some return from fees and revenue from natural resources. You have the DAK, which is a special allocation grant, which is earmarked for capital spending or for sector support. And fourth, you have the regional incentive grant called the DID, which actually is a grant given to those governments to meet key performance indicators. And the last one is something new called the village, well, new for 5 years now, 6 years, is the village fund, which is directly supporting to the villages. In the Philippines, it's far less complex. They have one main transfer called the IRA, which is based on, which has a portion which is an equal sharing among local governments, and a component which is based on population and land size. So it's simpler than Indonesia. But the key thing about those countries is that they have these transfers are not fully performance based. In the Philippines, there's a small grant called the Performance Challenge Fund, which is performance based and based on the performance of the local governments on good local governance. There is a seal of good local governance, which is an award given to local governments, and once they have that, they're able to tap this fund. In Indonesia, actually, we are working with the government there to improve the DID, the Regional Incentive Fund, to link it with the SDGs to make it more based performance. We're also working with government there to make sure the DAK disbursements, which is the earmark funds, are based on project performance. But all of these are work in progress, and we still have to see what the results are going forward in these two countries. My fourth and last point is actually on debt management. In Philippines, Indonesia, actually the debt of local government is not a big issue. The debt of local governments in Indonesia is around 0.3% of GDP. Philippines is around 0.6% of GDP. So they really haven't been incurring much debt there. So there, the problem is more of the opposite. As in, how are they to be encouraged and made aware of having more local government debt? In these countries, most of the borrowings come from the government banks. They don't really issue local government bonds. In the Philippines, there was an experiment, was a trial of bonds issued by local governments between the 1990s to the mid 2000s, but it stopped. Basically, the three reasons why they didn't happen, they did continue. Basically, one is the taxes on bonds was unclear. Number two was basically the lack of technical capacity. And number three is there was an absence of the secondary bond market in the Philippines for local government bonds. So it never progressed. They were mainly primary issuances. Also, an issue in the Philippines was that also there were no credit ratings for the local governments. So that impeded the development of local government bonds. In Indonesia, the law allows them to also issue local government bonds. We were working with the provinces of Central Java and DKA Jakarta, where we feel that they are capital market ready. But one constraint that we saw was awareness. Most of the local parliamentarians actually didn't understand what were local government bonds, and that impeded the clearances needed or the laws needed to be able to issue these local bonds. So I will stop there. Yolanda, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy, for your insightful comments and for sharing so many important experiences and lessons in the Philippines and Indonesia. I would like now to call Radhika Lai to deliver her remarks. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First, let me begin by expressing my appreciation. This was a really eloquent paper, and I think in pointing to, and it wasn't just about tax reforms, I think in pointing to the structural drivers of why China ended up with the kind of patterns that it did, was extremely important, because it also points to all the changes that need to happen with regard to the shift towards this new development agenda of high quality and not high speed, and all the changes that go with it, because these reforms are not taking place in real time. So to build on what Tan was asking, a couple of questions. One, we know that that China appears to be at a tipping point, but there are political economy challenges, and there are also challenges with not only the structural shifts, but also changes in mindsets. For years, there's been this focus on incentive structures around linked to GDP and growth and civil service performance. How do you facilitate that shift in mindsets towards a different type of development model at local levels, and taking on much more responsibility in terms of revenue mobilization, even if it's centrally driven? And what are some of the things that could accelerate those shifts in China and elsewhere, given that it's these are protracted issues in many countries? The second set of issues really is around the inequities around in different cities in China, but it's probably the case in many other countries. It is the case in many other countries as well. And the mix of financing would be quite different. So, for example, in some of the more developed cities, you could actually take on board land value capture to help with financing of infrastructure, as is being done in Singapore and some of the other countries. And how would that work with the sort of property tax piggyback that you're talking about? And what would be equivalent complementary measures, for example, in poorer municipalities? And then you very eloquently also point out that for second and third tier cities, just this focus on connectivity hasn't been enough to deal with either investment or migration patterns to the extent that was visualized. So in addition to the equalization grants, is there a case that can be made for additional catalytic, but perhaps more sustainable types of public investments that would then create the basis for not only own resource, but how it could survive as a model? You're going from, it's a very different model that you need to recover revenues from. And what do you do with the debt overhang in the meanwhile? Because, I mean, by some accounts, almost 70% of the borrowing was simply refinancing. So, how do you make these shifts in real time, given all the different constraints? How do you deal with the disparities beyond the issue of equalization grants? And how do you help the poorer municipalities make the shift? And with regard to this, perhaps just to mention that UNDP in China has been working and collaborating with a number of local governments at multiple levels in terms of SDG acceleration and innovation, SDG innovation demonstration zones. And perhaps these could be spaces not just for what needs to be done, but also the focus on the how. and the sharing of lessons across municipalities. So thinking about both the top-down measures plus the horizontal sort of competition, but also learning agenda, and how do you sort of promote that, in this kind of complex space, and facilitate this shift towards less GDP-centric measures, for example, and towards, as Shenzhen is doing with the grass ecosystem product, which begins to value nature-based inputs. But to think about the financing model for that, I, for one, am quite fascinated with the smart cities, given the way, in fact, these things have been done elsewhere. These are certainly more sustainable. But how do you finance them and how do you sustain them, in terms of our economic base? So again, appreciation to you, to ADB, for really opening up what has been a quite complicated set of issues. And as you said, hidden for the most part, in just, and it takes COVID to just really point out the extent to which things were just being pushed down on some national governments, in very difficult circumstances. So this opens up the space for that discussion. But the big question is really around the how and the political economy issues. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for sharing your views. I couldn't agree more with you on your point on focusing on the how. This is indeed very, very critical, and replication within the country based on sharing of successful experiences is also a very important part of the way forward, keeping in mind, of course, always the difficulties associated with sustainability. Let's now move to the third discussion. So I will invite Emma Fan to share her views. You have the floor, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yolanda, and congratulations to Atisham Hans for an excellent presentation and very insightful research, and also the interventions from my fellow panelists, Radhika and Joy, are extremely insightful. I think this paper and today's presentation really combines the analysis on the macro policy levels and combines the analysis of challenges as well as opportunities. It has great depth on the operational assessment at the subnational levels. So the paper also addresses the constraints in the current institutional, fiscal, and public finance environment in which the local governments operate. And it points to highly important, yet very sensitive and difficult reforms that need to be undertaken over a long term. So I guess this background, I just want to offer a few comments, maybe for future research and for further consideration. The first one is that we know as the presenters and the fellow panelists have pointed out, China's growth dynamics and the pattern have changed over time. From the high speed double-digit growth, it gradually moderated to over 6% before the pandemic. During the really high growth period, the local government could get away with more abundant revenue sources based on investment, production, and the related leasing of public land for the accumulation of physical assets, such as infrastructure, commercial and residential properties, production assets, and so on. But now, with the change of growth patterns and with the shift from an investment heavy model to the fact that the consumption will play a stronger role, how do we really see, how should we see the evolution of the fiscal system on a sustainable path at the local government level? So this, in the presentation, I think you pointed out about the property taxes, piggyback and the taxes and so forth. But we also need to see more fundamental structural changes in the revenue system. We know China has continuously undertaken revenue system reforms, especially in the more fundamental reforms undertaken in 1994. But have we really also reached a stage to really significantly revisit the revenue systems and the intergovernmental relationships between the central and the local governments? There are 5 levels of government. It's not just between the central government and provinces, but also between provinces and municipalities, counties, and townships. So that's, I think, one area probably we need to further examine moving forward. The second question maybe probably is just to play devil's advocate. We talked about the importance of own revenue sources at the local government levels, but also the fiscal transfer from the central government to local government are reasonably predictable. And if that's the case, should another scenario being considering how the revenue could be managed better in the central level and the transfer system be strengthened? Should that be also a consideration in the broad context of revenue reforms? And then the third question I have is, we did not really talk about the medium-term fiscal or budgetary frameworks. At the local level, we don't have many very successful examples, but in the PRC, can this kind of tools and frameworks be considered? Finally, I want to say that this paper, this research, and the stream of research that Hans has outlined really demonstrate the benefits of our continued engagement in the PRC upper middle income country on these very important matters. And especially the benefits in involving with very important agencies such as the National Development and Reform Commission and the Ministry of Finance. And we believe ADB's continued dialogue really will add value to the reform in the country, but also enrich our work on the public finance space, including on domestic resource mobilization. Thank you, Yolanda. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Emma. You have pointed out very important issues as well. One of them of critical importance is, of course, strengthening the midterm framework of local governments. And with this, I would like to thank the presenters and the discussants for the excellent contributions to the webinar. And now it is time to listen to the audience. So the floor is open for any question, comment, suggestion you might have. Please drop your views in the chat box. Thank you. Maybe while we wait for the questions to come, I would like to ask Hans and Etisham one question. There is one important point in this discussion, which is the definition of local government debt. We have been talking a lot about local governments, the role, but to what extent is the budget law in China appropriate and has a good definition of local government debt that will facilitate moving forward with reforms? This is very much related to a point that Etisham has stressed many times, which is the political economy, to what extent the political economy is constraining these reforms. Thank you.
If I may, with your permission, begin to answer the very thoughtful comments from the commentators, and also we can wait for the questions to come up, and also your question on debt definition. I think the definition of debt in the GFS is very clear, and it's a standard international practice. It's a practice which the central government has signed on to. Not today. I helped with this process when I was in the IMF almost in 2001 and 2. So it's a long-standing reform. It's not actually been properly implemented, as you said, for a number of reasons at the local level. And I think part of it may have been due to the fact that they don't actually have own source revenues. So really all of this is a little bit moot and needs to be reconsidered. And I think really what you have now with the 14th five-year plan is actually a major change in political stance. And in China, nothing happens unless it is signal from the plenum and endorsed by the state council. And clearly the management of risk, income distribution, and the environment were key elements in the medium-term budget in 2018 and are key issues in the 14th five-year plan and perspective plan. So really looking at own source revenues, which are not included in the 2018 medium-term budget plan, but are included in the 14th five-year plan, to me is a huge shift, which opens up the possibility of actually implementing a proper budget evaluation for risk management, which is a fundamental issue for them. So really, I think again and again, we see in our work over the last 5 years, and also the work over the last couple of years, as I said, in parallel, we've had this research program at the LSE with Chinese colleagues, is that what you're seeing is a mountain, is the tip of a mountain. And really getting to grips with this, there is a political economy story there clearly, and it has to be sequenced, but it's essential because, if there's one weakness in the entire fiscal edifice, it's this, because, this can blow the banking system as it happened in Spain. You didn't see it until you saw it. I was on the board of the IMF in 2008, and the Spanish Article 4 consultation in July said, no problem. Debt is below Maastricht levels, deficits below Maastricht requirements. Then all of a sudden you saw the liabilities parked in the cajas for the tourists from Germany and the United Kingdom and Scandinavia that stopped coming during the economic crisis, and they couldn't finance it. And then suddenly you had a banking crisis, which was a full-fledged subnational debt crisis. The same thing happened in Mexico, by the way, in 1998, with the tequila crisis. You had all this big infrastructure program, which are completely completely off budget, they were financed by the private sector, but with state banks. And again, they couldn't finance the roads because tolls were not enough. And you had a banking crisis, which then became a full-fledged, overnight, a full-fledged subnational debt crisis. So really, I think the examples from Mexico, Spain, so many other places in the world is that if you don't have a full appreciation of your full liabilities, this is a very dangerous game. It may not blow immediately, but you really should be moving very quickly. And after the financial crisis, France began to move towards requiring local governments to have full balance sheets, because this is a problem and people recognize it as a problem. Let me also begin with, I think some of the comments were very, very thoughtful. Let me start with Emma's very thoughtful comments. You showed us the growing deficit, shall we say, particularly since 2016 in those two graphs. But let me point out that in China, the deficit in that period from around 2015 till 2018 was around 3% of GDP, 3.5% of GDP, lower than the average of emerging market countries, and much lower than India, which was around 7% of GDP, about half the Indian deficit. It went up from around 2018 to 6% of GDP, and then 11% of GDP, the deficit, in 2020. But the earlier increase in the deficit was the counter-cyclical policy to counteract the effects of the trade disruptions. These were Trump trade disruptions. They cut taxes, which meant that local governments had less revenues, but they were told to protect employment. So really that huge budgetary pressures at the local level. And then you have COVID. Now the COVID cyclical response in China is around, the IMF estimates around 4.5% of GDP, which is both above the line, below the line, which is a much lower than what they were able to do in 2010, which was about 11% of GDP, which basically it saved the global economy at that time. They can't do it now because the liabilities they know are rising. They actually don't know how big they are, which is very, very dangerous. And that's why all the things that we're talking about, the importance of getting a grip on the liabilities, absolutely essential. So really, the counter-cyclical, they realize that the counter-cyclical policies cannot match what they did previously for this reason. Remember that in 2018, the medium-term budget said, key issue, Liu He's point, management of risk. This is one of the key elements of the management of risk. So that's a problem. And of course also looking at, I know that Hans wants to come in the medium-term framework, but there's a lot of discussion about, medium-term budget frameworks and also fiscal rules. Now, fiscal rules, have been suspended in the European Union during the pandemic. They may not go back to fiscal rules, although the Germans would like that to happen. My former colleague, Blanchard, is now questioning whether you should have fiscal rules at all. There's a big debate about fiscal standards, which are actually even more difficult to estimate. You're looking at stochastic structural balances. But, my former boss, Vito Tanzi, used to say that if you have responsible governments, the rules don't matter. If you have irresponsible governments, they'll get around them anyway by hiding the liabilities. So, you can have a fiscal rule, but if you don't have full information, it's not what the paper is written on. You need full information, including all the liabilities that you should have on the balance sheet. And you need on-source revenues, without which it makes no sense to have a fiscal rule. And you need clarity in spending. If you don't have clarity in spending at the local level, subnational, local meaning subnational in China, how can you hold them responsible for the spending? Because they'll always push it up. Somebody else is responsible. So really, that's also a problem for the medium-term budget framework. So if you have shifting responsibilities, how can you have a medium-term expenditure framework? I can't see that it means very much in the current context, although it's useful to have it in the longer run. So that's by way of, sort of comments on the third point from Emma I'd like to comment on briefly, the predictability of central government transfers. Yes, the central government transfers by and large are predictable. They have a good equalization framework. You have a revenue sharing arrangement, which actually fluctuates. But the problem is that a debt sustainability analysis, if you take the Simonsen model, you're looking at the increase in debt, that's a delta D, is a function of interest rates and your change in your revenue base, your delta R. So if your delta R is 0, which is what it would be with fixed transfers, you cannot anchor your debt, your delta R. So really you have a problem, because you can't actually have a rule or sustainability issue with just predictable central transfers, even if they're untied. You can begin to work on earmark transfers, and Indonesia is doing that, and maybe an issue in China, and clearly have to be an issue in China in the medium term. So this touches on one of Radhika's very interesting points. I will not touch on every point that she made, which I think I agree with a lot of them. I think that there are political economy issues. I've worked in China now since the 1980s, initially as a researcher. Nick Stern and I set up the collaboration between China, the LSE, the DRC, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Chinese universities. So a lot of the people who are now in government have been through the LSE and are friends. And then, you know, work in the IMF. I've led missions. My first mission to the PRC was in 1990, exploring what the Fiscal Affairs Department could do for China. And they said, we're different. Actually, we don't need any help. But they came back to us in 1993, 94, and I helped with the revenue sharing and equalization systems. And then with the budget reforms, and then with the treasury reforms. And by the way, what the Chinese have done on the treasury single account, adoption of GFSM framework at the central level, the Mexicans still haven't got there. So, you know, Mexico is an OECD country, NAFTA. They still don't have a treasury single account. So China, in many respects, has learned from international best practice. And, you know, our policy always has been not to tell them what to do, but to work on the options given international experience, and they clearly work out what works for them. So that's one way of.
Thank you, Etisham. We have some questions waiting in the chat box. Let me move ahead. We have one question from Dominique Pichel. Would you like to articulate the question?
Yeah, thank you, Yolanda, and thank you for this presentation. I would like to ask about the own revenue sources that was mentioned, and there's in particular one idea about piggyback tax, and this should break the cyclicality, as I understood from the presentation. According to my understanding, usually you levy a piggyback tax on some other tax and as a proportion. So that would be still proportionally. So if the overall tax amount would go down, also the piggybacked amount would go down in my view. So I'm not really clear how this should work in the case of China, that it's that it is not cyclical anymore, and being a piggyback tax at the same time. Of course, you could change the tax system that they have some leeway to set rates independently, but then most likely it wouldn't characterize as a piggyback tax. And related to that, if we talk about own revenue, and this relates to Emma's comment, there's kind of a trade-off how to do the financing between giving own revenues and getting more transfers. And I guess maybe the solution is using both tools, because I looked at the revenue, and for example, if you look at PIT, personal income tax, that could be used as a piggyback. This has only at the moment 1% of GDP in revenues, while the transfers are around 7 to 8% if you look at total transfers. So it's a total different magnitude. And that would be really interesting what you make out of that, and how you would how you were to design it. Thank you.
Yeah, these are actually very interesting questions. There are different ways of doing the piggyback, and one of them, as you mentioned, is a proportion of what is collected by the central government. Another alternative is for a local government to determine the number of percentage points within a band that it can impose. So really all you do is say maybe 4 or 5 percentage points set by a local government on a central government base. That does not vary by according to the tax rate of the central government. So that's a certain percentage points on a fixed base. That's invariant to the tax rate, which may or may not be adjusted at the central government level. And you know, China is a unitary state, and as a matter of fact, it already has an example of this. The State Council legislates a ban on property sale tax. So a tax on property sales is legislated at the State Council level in a band. The provinces choose within that band, and then the cities can choose within the band chosen by the province. That's the example of the piggyback I'm talking about, which is already in the law in China, and it's all it requires is for a city to say, I have 2 or 3 percentage points that I'd like to utilize. And that's in this sense the piggyback. It's not a proportion of the way you have defined it. And of course, if you have an equalization system, and the equalization system which is in place in China is one that that provides similar level of transfers, which is normalized, to similar level of tax effort. Now, the problem is they don't have any tax effort. They don't have any taxes on which you can have a tax effort. So it's only on the spending side. So equalization of spending without, a correspondent component, which is critical, in equalization, modern equalization systems in Scandinavia or Australia or even Canada, which is less complete because they don't look at the expenditure side, is that you need both. And equalization system should not be linked to what local governments do or don't do. Because the moment you are linking it to their deficits, then you break the back of the equalization system. Because then, it's in the interest of the local government not to raise revenue and to expand expenditures. And this is a mistake that's made quite often in Latin America in particular. It's a completely mistaken way of equalizing. Now, I think Radhika correctly pointed to the need for transfers which are performance-based for things like infrastructure. This is one of the examples that Tan had from Indonesia. So really what you want is an investment program linked to the creation of these sustainable investment hubs. And as I said, the key issue is to have investment and financing to be properly coordinated. And there you need some work with the NDRC to look at the spatial dynamics of where you want to put these employment hubs. The focus in the 13th five-year plan was on the capital city clusters, and that has created inequality within provinces. So really you need to go in within provinces to see where you're going to relocate the activities. And of course, if you have a system of financing, which China has had, of land value capture, and for a while, the Shenzhen model of land value capture used to be written about as a model to follow. But what you have in China is that, a complete loss of prime agricultural land, wetlands, urban sprawl, congestion and pollution right through the Eastern Seaboard. So really any attempt to meet the Paris Agreement targets or net zero by 2030 requires a major shift of activities away from the big metropolitan area. It's underway in Beijing. Move people out of Beijing to smaller hubs. There's a new IT-based hub, which is actually quite interesting on blockchain. About
Sorry, Etisham, I need to interrupt. We have 2 minutes to go, and there is one question in the chat box that I would like to read out. This is from Yupeng Zheng. He's asking, what is the domestic revenue distribution mechanism of central and local governments in the PSC? And if it's there any direction for reform post-pandemic? And I can only give you 1 minute to respond, sorry.
China already has revenue sharing and equalization. What you need in addition for the pandemic is additional transfers, earmark transfers for, say, hospitals or for vaccines, as the Germans have done, to provide support for households and firms at the local level. So really, it's an extension of Tan's point and Radhika's point about earmark transfers as elements into the Building Back Better agenda, which will be stepping stones to eventually to a performance budgeting system. But as I said, it's going to be a while before that happens. So I think I'll stop at that. And these are things that we can continue discussing.
Thank you very much. It is almost 10:30, less than 1 minute to go. So let me wrap up this excellent seminar saying thank you.
Can you
to
hear
all
the
of you.
thunder?
Yeah.
Can you hear the thunder in Washington?
Yes.
Before the lights go off.
So thank you very much. Also for those, that have been working behind the scenes to make this event happen, and the wonderful IT and excellent translation services that we also enjoy. And just one short announcement before we close the session. You will receive a survey. Please, it's a very short one. Your feedback is very important for us. So just take the time, if you can, to fill it. Thank you very much for this excellent session, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.